I don't know if at any point in our lives we fully realize why things go well and why things go badly, but I think especially when things are going well, it's hard to get our minds around the people and the situations that have made our lives good. And I'm thinking now particularly of Westmont College, what makes this such a good place. And there's lots of people involved in that, very important people. Among them is a man that I'm so grateful God brought here, is our president. Gayle Beebe has the courage of a leader and the wisdom it takes. He has a pastor's heart and a scholar's mind, and he's just a lot of fun. And I'm grateful for Gayle's memory and for his love for you students. It's just tremendous to watch him. So Gayle, welcome back. Welcome to chapel. And we welcome you in the name of Christ.
Good to be back. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, it's great to be back. I hope you picked up. Guys, you don't have your handouts. Come on. What kind of students are you? Okay, there you go. A+. Joe, thank you. All right, take out your handy-dandy outline. We're going to be working through this. I'm going to try to make this a non-academic academic event. Thank you. Thank you. I like the applause, the laughter. I'd actually like to talk to you this morning about something that I think that you often face, because it's something that I often face. And that is the dual tension that we feel between envy and contentment. Envy is spoken of throughout Scripture. We're going to come to just a few of the choice places where it's highlighted in Scripture. And contentment is as well. Find your contentment in the Lord. Be drawn to the things that bring you the greatest joy and happiness. Find the things of lasting eternal value. But so often we get preoccupied with the way in which we compare ourselves to others. And the way in which we compare ourselves to others ends up ruining the way in which we can celebrate and enjoy the gifts God has given us. One of my favorite authors is Walker Percy. He wrote many books. He's now deceased. Walker Percy was trained to be a medical doctor, developed tuberculosis, and was never able to practice medicine. And so he turned his considerable gifts to writing, and he began to write novels. He was very influenced by the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard, and if you know the great Danish philosopher from the 19th century, you know that he was considered the father of existentialism, the capacity that we have as humans to choose how our life will unfold. Now, Kierkegaard never liked the title per se. He thought that it actually isolated him from what he truly believed. Nevertheless, Walker Percy picks up these themes, these very Kierkegaardian themes of the way in which we make choices that fundamentally determine and reveal the kind of person we are and the type of life we'll have. One of his later novels was published in 1983 called Lost in the Cosmos. And it's somewhat of a unique Percy novel in that he spends considerable amounts of time exploring the different ways in which a person embodies themselves. He has 20 different illustrations. It's somewhat foreshadowing Kierkegaard's book Either Or, his 2-volume philosophical treatise that dealt with the difference between people who live out of an aesthetic or an aesthete personality and those who live out of an ethical personality. But Percy's main concern is to show us the way in which we become so preoccupied with who we want to be that we really miss the greater meaning in life. He has the proud self. He has the selfish self. But for our purposes this morning, I want us to consider briefly the envious self. Percy spends more time on the envious self than any other of the selves. And the envious self is the person who gets so preoccupied with how they compare to others that it ruins their ability to make choices that will actually improve their life and keep them on the path for which they were intended. Now, he goes through a variety of illustrations of this, including one that we'll come to later, which is, why is it that we get a greater sense of joy, not from our own accomplishments, but from the misfortune that happens to our arch rival? Why is it that we get greater joy, not out of our own accomplishments, but out of the misfortune that happens to our arch rival? Well, to help us in our understanding and to gain insight for our own life, I want to return to Evagrius of Pontus, the spiritual life, his journey. I dealt with him in the spring when we were looking at anger and the way in which he had portrayed the disruptive influence that anger has on our life. Evagrius, as you'll remember, for those of you who were here last spring, lived in the 4th century, was a great thinker in the history of the church. He began in Constantinople. And he was headed for high churchly office. He lived a very noble life for many years. But he did something that always gets you in trouble. He fell in love with a married woman. And that is certain to bring a lot of harm. He realized he was going to have to flee Constantinople to save his very life. He went first to Jerusalem and eventually settled on the Egyptian desert. And it was on the Egyptian desert that he began to think back through his life and to really excavate his soul, to look at the choices he had made, the temptations to which he had fallen, and to think about what had happened that led him to such demise. He could hardly believe that this was in fact God's destiny for him. In fact, it's hard to imagine that this was God's destiny for him. But as he began to rebuild his life, he recognized that God still had a life for him. And he identified and began to write about the 8 deadly thoughts. In the 6th and early 7th century, Gregory the Great would codify these into the 7 deadly sins. But these 8 deadly thoughts were pivotal in helping us understand what goes on inside our mind and the way in which it influences the way we behave as humans. And these are identified for you there: gluttony, anger, greed, envy, pride, lust, indifference, and melancholy. Evagrius went on to talk about how each of these are thoughts that rise up in our mind or awaken in our mind certain attitudes, certain behaviors that we're often frequently tempted to act upon. Now, growing up in my father's home, he had grown up on a farm in eastern Oregon. He used a lot of farm wisdom or just little quips. And one of my most memorable quips from my dad was, "When temptation knocks, imagination usually answers the door." When temptation knocks, imagination usually answers the door. This is the heart of Evagrius. When these ideas come up in our mind, what do we do to have the spiritual energy to resist temptation, to resist the gravity of our own self-centeredness that leads us into patterns that actually ruin our life and our opportunity and the very life God intended for us? Well, when we come to the particular aspect of envy, we begin to recognize how disruptive envy can be to our life. How disruptive it can be both to be the victim of the envy of others, but also to fall victim to it ourselves. Now, there are so many passages of Scripture to which we could turn our attention, but I just wanted to highlight 2 from the book of Proverbs, and then come to 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, where it contrasts the nature of love with, among other things, the spirit of envy. Just listen briefly to these passages. Proverbs 14:30. "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Or Proverbs 23:17. "Do not let your heart envy, but always be zealous for the love of the Lord." Or 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. "Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails." Part of the point that is made about envy is that it destroys our capacity to live in community. It is the energy that erodes the capacity to get along well. Envy often gives rise to petty jealousy, to gossip, to our inability to celebrate the gifts that God has given to others. Now, in preparing my message for this morning, I wanted to dive back into some of the recent literature on envy, neuroscience, and the way in which neuroscience and psychology are helping us understand these very core 8 deadly thoughts or 7 deadly sins, and the way in which they actually rechannel our brain. Now, the 2 types of envy that are identified within the literature, and it was actually quite fun reading through the literature, are inferiority and schadenfreude. Now, my German is not good, and so I contacted Dr. Tom Fikes, and I said, "Tom, how do I say this word? Because it's a word from neuroscience." And Tom wasn't sure he could pronounce it, so he sent me a German saying the word in English so that I could get my intonation correct. I'd hate to play it for you because I still can't say it correctly. But the basic premise is this. You either feel inferior towards others, and that sparks your envy, or you have this unique spirit of Schadenfreude, which is, simply put, you find delight in the harm that comes to your arch-rival. Who is it that you envy? Who is it that you resent? When misfortune happens to them, you actually feel better. Now, this is something that Evagrius noticed in the 4th century, and we're noticing in the 21st. This is native to who we are as humans. And so what can we do to actually overcome it? Well, at the end of my message, I want to come to the issue of contentment and the way in which God gives us both resources and desires to develop a spirit of contentment that actually allows us to build community and allows us to overcome this very natural tendency we have as humans to prefer ourselves to others. Now, as we look at envy, we realize that we're just inclined as humans to compare ourselves to others. In fact, this is something that just goes on all the time. We can almost not resist it. And yet, all of neuroscience is helping us understand that if we can begin to rechannel these feelings of envy into either moderating them or even developing a spirit of contentment, it will be fundamentally healthy for us. One study that these neuroscientists did to try and determine why do we feel the way we feel was conducted in Japan. And as I was reading through the literature, it was just fascinating. Here's how they set it up. They identified 3 different sets of characters that they would put in front of the test group. One group was going after the same job, they were from the same gender, but they were portrayed as having better qualifications. The second set that was put in front of the test group, they were going after a different job, they were a different gender, and they were still better qualified. And then the third set, a different job, a different gender, but with inferior qualifications. Now, what was so interesting is all of the members, 100% of the members in the test group, expressed the greatest envy towards number 1. In other words, the people most like them and seeking the jobs that they most desired. Envy is often expressed not for somebody far away, but about people who we live with, often even within our own families. Now, an illustration of this is the story of Cain and Abel from Genesis 4, and we don't have time to go into it here. But this story is about the first murder in the Bible. And what does it entail? For some reason, Abel's sacrifice pleased God, and Cain's didn't. And Cain can't control his disgust with this outcome, and he ends up murdering Abel. Envy has that kind of power, the capacity that we have to destroy the gifts of others simply because we don't feel accepted ourselves. By contrast, how do we cultivate contentment? I think there are 5 ways that we can really be committed to cultivating contentment. And I think it begins with your own attitude. 2 things in life that you can control are your attitude and your effort. And so many of the things that we have to undergo are the spiritual disciplines that actually reroute the natural inclination of our heart. I think the second thing is to engage in a life of prayer. Think about who you deeply resent, who you deeply envy, and how it disrupts you. And begin to pray for them. There's no sense at all that it will change them, but it will change you. And it will change the way in which this individual holds power over you. Now, I used to work with people that were in the 12-step movement, and I remember one guy that I worked with quite a bit who one day, he was really coming to terms with his envy. He so badly wanted to be like this very close friend. And he said, I'm just so tired of this guy living in my mind rent-free. And I've often thought about that as, what does envy do? It causes people to be in our minds, taking up space when we really should be focused on so many other things. Now, the impact of prayer and the spiritual disciplines on the brain. This is taken from Andrew Newberg's book, How God Changes Our Brain. And I just think it's a masterful treatment. If you know the book, you know just what a compelling case it makes for what we're discovering from neuroscience. But Newberg starts the book with this very telling observation. He says, look, I'm not even sure I believe in God, but I can prove to you that believing in God will fundamentally make for a better life, that you will have a more joyful, happier life if you believe in God and really begin to live your life as if God exists. I highly recommend the book to you, not because it's Christian, because it's not, but because it makes such a compelling case for the Christian life. But the impact of prayer and spiritual disciplines on the brain are numerous. First, it enhances our social awareness and our compassion. Now, one of the great things to human community is our capacity to express compassion for members of the community. When we see people that are not getting along, when we see people that are hurt, our ability to actually respond is a great sign of our human nature. When I was a college student, I had to do work study as part of my financial aid plan to get through college. And I worked alongside a guy named Eric. He had come from the Oregon coast. I had grown up in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. We were both attending a school in Oregon. And as we worked together, I noticed one day that his shoes were just in terrible disrepair. And growing up in Western Oregon, it's not particularly cold, but it's always wet, or often wet. And I asked him one day why he always wore shoes that were in disrepair. And he said, well, these are actually the only ones I have besides the ones I wear on Sunday. And I was not a wealthy college student by any stretch of the imagination, but I certainly had more money than Eric. And I really became convicted about the fact that one thing I could do for Eric is just provide him with an alternative pair of shoes. And so I headed downtown to the thrift shop, and I remember standing in the shoe section of the thrift shop, looking at these shoes, all of which would have fit Eric beautifully, and saying to myself, I would never buy shoes here for myself. I'm going to go to the sporting goods store and buy a pair of shoes that I would buy for myself and give them to Eric. Well, long story short, I ended up buying a pair of shoes for Eric. I give them to him anonymously, and it was the most joyous experience for me of being able to see Eric have adequate shoes to get around the wet Oregon winters without ever knowing that it was me. One of the things that I think that you can do to help build a great community at Westmont is to look for these opportunities where you can be spontaneously kind to people that you're living with, living around, serving with, studying with, even competing with. And as you do these acts of kindness, it's not just that it benefits the lives of these other individuals, it benefits your life. And you begin to realize the graciousness of God and the mercy of God in extending other people into your life in order that you in turn can extend your life into theirs. Now, Newberg tells us that these acts or practices of prayer and spiritual discipline strengthen the anterior cingulate in our brain, the connecting link between the limbic system and the frontal lobe, and essentially how it balances out reason and emotion. And that if that is in balance, that we can actually make reasonable responses to very disruptive behaviors. Now, why do I say this, or why do I find this even important? I think you need to begin to learn spiritual disciplines now, because one of the greatest problems that you're going to have in life is your need to self-regulate. As I have gone on in adult life, the single greatest problem that adults face, beyond just natural disasters and physical mishaps, the single biggest problem is their own inability to regulate themselves. In other words, they get in situations where they self-destruct. They commit what I would call career-limiting mistakes. They become disruptive in ways. And I have so many examples of being in situations where people lost their ability to self-regulate, and it ruined their opportunity. You're going to end up in the same situations. And as you enter these situations, you're going to need to be able to discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. Now, I believe some people are wired just by natural aptitude, personality. They are just inclined to a content spirit. Other people aren't. But wherever you fall on that spectrum, the opportunity that you have is to actually go through this process of understanding your life with God well enough so that you can discipline those disruptive moods, behaviors, tendencies, and rechannel them so that it can actually make a great contribution to your life. The fourth thing is to serve others. The benefit is that it cultivates the channels within which empathy will be developed. Now, as I read so many books today, one of the great needs of our culture and of our society is the capacity for empathy. The fifth is to help cultivate communities that are filled with love, communication, and sensory and intellectual stimulation. That's Westmont, a community that is filled with sensory and intellectual stimulation, but also filled with a desire to love and to communicate that love. Now, I think your life will be full and rich and good if you can develop these capacities. But ultimately, all of us have to develop or pursue a life of contentment if we're going to be able to overcome our inclination to envy. Now, the last picture that I wanted Brad to put up was a picture of my favorite person. Now, isn't that a great picture? She's not here today. She actually is down in Los Angeles, so I knew I could get away with this because otherwise I'd get severely censored at dinner tonight. But Pam is just a person who lives with great contentment. And I often joke that I had the good fortune to marry a lot better than she did. I, by nature, am turbulent. I have always been turbulent. Pam, by nature, is content. And so she is a great example to me of a person who has a disposition of contentment, but also at the same time, I watch her every morning get up, and I watch her go through her own spiritual disciplines of praying, of really thinking through her day, of thinking about what happened the day before, of where we are with the children, how are they doing, what's going on in their life. And it's this disposition of life that gives me such a great living daily example of how we can experience contentment and the benefit that that brings to our life. Now, I think the reason Pam has so much energy for other people is because she is so at peace with how God has made her and how God intends to use her. She does not exaggerate her abilities. She's extremely gifted. She's extremely bright. You would never know that from her. What she would want to be is just a presence, a living presence that you can experience, that you can enjoy, that you can find as a friend, a great counselor. But I think in that contentment, she expresses to me, and certainly to those who know her, a desire that each of us find what God has for us, that we not try to be something that we aren't, but that we really become all that God has created us to be. When I was growing up in Eugene, I always wanted to be a professional athlete. And I think it's the childhood dream of so many kids my age, that we all wanted to be professional athletes. And the reality was that for a while I was extremely good and was very competitive. And my arch rival, we would go back and forth, and he played for a rival team, and we would compare ourselves to each other, and he would often beat me, and his teams would win. Occasionally we would win. And as we came to the end of high school, what I wanted to do with my life was completely derailed. And the way in which I wanted to spend my time pursuing an athletic career never materialized. He went on, played professional baseball, played professional basketball, is now a sports executive. And I look at his life and I look at my life, and as kids, we wanted our lives very much to go the same path. And yet God redirected my life from what I had thought or hoped my life would be about. And as I look back on the way in which God has redirected my life, there are so many times in which I am grateful for the opportunities God has given me that I otherwise would never have pursued. And what I want to lay in front of you this morning as we conclude is, as you're at Westmont, as you engage your studies, as you come to a sense of who you are and how God has wired you, begin to embrace it, learn to celebrate it, and learn to pursue God for all that He wants to do through your life. Because even if life hasn't gone all of the ways in which you had hoped or intended, God still has great purposes for you and still wants to use you in incredible ways that will bless you and benefit His kingdom. God be with you. I'm looking forward to a great year.